introduction, which begins propositions 73 through 89. And then we'll do sense certainty. If I remember correctly, it was 90 through 11. Sure. 10. And perception, which is 111. 130, I think. I don't know if we're going to get through all of this, but we can recapture it next week as well. And then for next week, let's do force and understanding. Yeah. So for next week, force and understanding, which is a break, if you will. I'm going to call this a break with the epistemological subject. And then in the week after that, we'll do consciousness in general, and self-consciousness, we'll do all that. And then I'll do maybe a recapitulation of everything, and then we'll move on just a little bit to some of the sections later on. But we'll get through all the shapes of consciousness and the historical moments of the shapes of consciousness. And then we'll I think it'd probably be best to talk about the relationship to Schelling, then the relationship to the Schlegel brothers and the avant-garde, and then move on to Derrida and finish with the Derrida piece. At least for this semester. I don't mind doing more,
Can we still do the Rimbaud, the Mallarme and the poetry?
Yeah, we're going to do that still. Yeah, I was going to do Mallarme and one Rimbaud, and Derrida as reactions in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. A philosophical reaction, the post-structuralist reaction, and where that edge is, and then we'll look at Poetic, The Throw of the Die by Mallarme, which is actually a movie made. Every revolution is a throw of the die. There's a film made, Chantal Ackerman, and then we'll also look at Rimbaud's seminal poem called Democracy, which is not coming to the USA.
Yeah, that's the same thought I had as
yes, right. So anyway, okay. So all right. So in force of the understanding next week. Well, you know the sections. The sections are 132 all the way through up to the truth of self-certainty. Goes all the way to 165. So 132 to 165. Okay, so this will take us through the epistemological, investigation, if you will, by Hegel, and also the destruction of the epistemological constructs. And I want to repeat again his attempt here. We'll go to the introduction, but his attempt in these three chapters, sense, certainty, perception, force, and understanding, is to make sure we find the right beginning, which is the beginning of presuppositionalist philosophy. And I'm going to put that in red on the board. This is where he's going. This must be the beginning. Only through this will we get to the science of the experience of consciousness. Okay, so please keep this in mind. He is always engaging that sense certainty begins a ground zero, if you will, a 0 point, if you will, of unmediated, or if you will, 0 point of mediation. involving sense data. We'll go back to some of these terms, right? Yeah. So we're going to see this at work, and then we'll look at language in that context. And, the real issue here, in some ways, is the indifferent this. The indifference this. So subject-object, Josh, for your purposes, is still part of the traditional, right, investigation into epistemology. Mm-hmm. He is not the only one, or is he engaged in that because he wants to get here at the beginning. And the pre is very important. Mm-hmm. What is the pre? Conditions. Yeah, not the conditions themselves, right? But the pre-suppositionalist philosophy. So there's a kind of erasure going on. You can see where Derrida in some ways got the concept of under erasure. Mm-hmm. The X of the is a very Hegelian move by him. The Sur Tour. We'll talk more about that when we get to Derrida. But the is that kind of move. Yeah. All right. So So maybe we go first tonight to the introduction. Let me just say this once again to put it in the sense of, if you will, a novel, again, a Bildung. You again, in the sense certainty and in perception, you have the observed reason and the observing reason, right? This is the two roles that are going on in terms of sense certainty and how it's constituted. The observed reason, right? Yeah. Right? And then, of course, the observing. So very, very important, and how consciousness breaks out of the sensible world. Right? So the verb, yeah. So it's the movement of both receiving and conceiving. Okay? So think about this as part of the dialectical movement. A movement of reception and of conception going forward. Okay? So let's go back to the introduction though. And what struck you about that, Mia? Tell me a little bit about your...
I'd have to look at it.
Yeah, this is on, of course, Proposition 73, where he begins with, quote unquote, the study of philosophy once again. And this can be, related again back to the preface. And please go ahead.
Something about Proposition 86.
Okay.
I thought it was really interesting about how once the object is in a relation with consciousness, it alters the object, so that's the truth of the object.
Okay.
In some way.
Maybe we can read this section. It's a good section. Let me see if I can get this. This is, of course, the movement of concept and object that he's speaking about here in the introduction. I mean, the introduction, once again, is the question about how to begin. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? Hegel is always asking this question, how do we begin? The preface is a kind of saying beforehand, and what we were looking at are these interconnections between multiple, levels of both knowing and the known object, etc., with many, diversions into mathematical objects as well as into, and we should have brought that up last night about the ratiocination.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I know, so we can bring it all in all the time.
Yeah. So, but anyway, but the introduction is primarily concerned with how to begin. Yeah. And really the assumption that he's going to begin with, his own assumption, is that philosophy ultimately will give true knowledge, right? This is the thing, to go to absolute knowing, right? Yeah. This is the goal, the telos, if you will. So you never, neither before the beginning, never after it, you just begin at the beginning, right? And this is a very hard finding the right starting point, right? Is part of the introduction. Okay, so the first step is really to eliminate any kind of false starts.
Well, I mean, it's also in context, right? He's responding to this sentiment of time that really privileges the epistemology, and
Yes.
where to start, and the faulty beginning, or potentially the faulty beginnings of knowledge, basically.
Right.
So I mean, I think, like, to me, this sentiment was really strong here. You know, he's saying you got to start. You can't just keep asking where should we start.
Right. Well, the thing is, again, as you mentioned, in terms of the sociality, if you will, of his moment, right? And this is an argument against the Fichtean and the Schelling, doctrines of knowing. The knowing as positing the object, right? And the I in that relation to the object, and constituting the object that way. Of course, totally against the Cartesian false start, which he would say it cannot happen in a vacuum. For all of Hegel's, moment of trying to get a presuppositionalist, he's still bound to the historical context, right? He's really working with that. So there are multiple registers always happening. And this is the beauty of his thinking, in my opinion. Yes, go ahead, yeah.
Is the whole thing about like the instrument of cognition versus like the thing of cognition, like reference to Kant and this?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And that's a really essential point too. That
Yes.
the instrument leaves its mark on the object under
Absolutely.
observation.
Absolutely, he is really looking at this very, very seriously and with great lucidity.
And the medium, his critique of the medium of knowledge too.
Yeah, I'll put those
also,
terms on the board. So
is also important.
The instrument.
I thought it was interesting how he like says of these words like absolute, cognition, objective, like all of these things are familiar. We think we know what they are.
Right. So let's go to what you're saying. I mean, where this 86 is. So
Yeah, I wrote 85 and 86
since you
as
like
well.
this so much, page 55 in my text. Is it 55 in yours?
Yeah.
Too? Okay. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself and which affects both its knowledge and its object is precisely what is called experience. So we have our first definition of experience, right? Very, very important, right? Affects both knowledge and its objects and is conscious. In this, and remember, the real title of this book in the beginning, and Heidegger picks up on this and has a very long essay on it, it is the science of the experience of consciousness.
And
or
Heidegger's
the
point
phenomenology of the spirit. Yes, go ahead.
of Erfahrung too is to travel along, right? The German translation.
Yeah,
It's
Erfahrung
like to take a
is
path.
one
Travel
verb
along
is
a path.
traveling along. Yes, that's well put.
Yeah.
Because Erlebnis is lived experience,
Mm-hmm.
whereas this is traveling along experience, right? And I think we made distinctions when we did phenomenology years ago. We'll get to that. Yeah. When we did phenomenology, we made distinctions between Erlebnis and Erfahrung.
Mm-hmm.
And Erfahrung is rightly put that the repetition, the Wiederholung, is the hauling along, right, the traveling along
Right.
of experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is very, very interesting and a very material. It's very material, this language, in so many ways. So in this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned, which must be brought out more clearly, for through it a new light will be thrown on the exposition which follows. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence or the in itself. But it is also, for consciousness, the in itself. Right? So you have both a for and the is, right? This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first, the in itself. The second is being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself. What consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object. But, as was shown previously, the first object, in being known, is altered for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this, then, is the true, the being for consciousness of this in itself. Or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it. So the traveling along with the object, right? Where you actually have known the object, you become the object, in many ways. You know, in martial arts, you are the object in a good martial arts practice. Hegel speaking of the same thing. We always try to think of ourselves as subject or subjectivity or selves or whatever. But really, it's much more profound if you start thinking of yourself as an object. Not in the sense that it's used loosely in the everyday sense of objectification.
Right, it's not the empirical object.
That's not the empirical object.
It's the mediated object.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's good. You want to make up some other comments about that? I mean, I just read it so we, be acclimated to it.
No, the 87 was where I was really getting into it, I guess.
Okay.
This is a dense section, though.
Okay, how about you, Mia? You had anything else to say about this? I mean, this is basically the movement, if you will, of the in itself, right? And they're being conscious for,
I mean, I guess I thought it was interesting in terms of this question of like where to begin. He sort of like,
right.
He sort of, it seems like, almost like, I mean, what I'm taking from what he's saying, and I don't know if that's right, but is that like it's kind of becomes pointless to ask what it was before, because the minute you look at it, you like alter it and involve it.
Right.
It reminded me of like Schrodinger's cat in a way. Like once you like look at it, you're in an engagement with it, and so like it becomes impossible to say what it is outside of that or something.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Is that on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good track, yeah. And this will play back in the section on perception as well. Yeah, they'll go back to this kind of knowing, if you will, and the relationship of consciousness to the object, right? That's a good way of looking at it. Again, just to emphasize, in the introduction, he's going to talk about the work to be accomplished, which is philosophy as a science of experience, once again. And this word, Wissenschaften, which is loosely translated as science, right, is really basically the process of accomplishing knowledge is Wissenschaften. That's what science is, right? To turn the concrete into the abstract, or the empirical more into the theoretical abstract, in our sense. And this is his rereading, if you will, of episteme from the Greeks. This is a conversation that is going on between Hegel and the Greeks and Heidegger and the Greeks. What is episteme, where we get the word epistemology, and that of Wissenschaften. And Schaften, the suffix, really means to turn the concrete into the abstract. Scientia, science too. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. So this is where he's going here. Now the other part here, we're just talking about this again with the section you pointed to. The other thematic, if you will, overarching thematic. One is the philosophical work to be accomplished, which is the science of the experience of consciousness. The other work that is going on is the beginning of consciousness as a process. There's never a fixity. What you're really talking about in this alteration is really process.
Right.
For Hegel, is very processional. It's always about process and spheres. If I were to retitle this book, in terms of, looking at it both intellectually and spatially, process and spheres. Right? That would be my retranslation of the book. The science of processes and of spheres. Okay? So, this is just a riff, right? But I think it's relevant, right? So, process and spheres. So you have to always think this way. It's scary, but because we're so conditioned to stay fixed at certain points. And this is exactly what he's trying to get away from is this fixity of knowledge, right? Always, always, already. This is always going on. So it's the processional. It's very much like the science of the unconscious, if you will, in psychoanalysis, unless you undergo process, and in Lacan's case, the subversion of the subject and the dialectic of desire, you'll never get to the dialectic of desire if you don't undergo that subversion of the sujet, because you'll never know what it is you desire, really, right? Or at least what your unconscious is saying, might not be you, maybe, who knows, yeah. The monsters of the id speaking, right? Okay, so I think this is important again. So this is a very good section. So you want to go on, Josh? I just wanted to interject that because, again, this introduction is where Jean Hippolyte, unlike what we did, read the preface first, says we should begin with the introduction. And this is going on in his work called Genesis and Structure in Hegel's Phenomenology, which is still one of the best textual exegesis of the phenomenology out there. I mean, I recommend it as a supplement. After reading this the first time, I think it'll give you great clarity that you're not going to be able to get in, 20 hours of classroom work on this, So, yeah, I mean, this is hard work, You can go through all of these multiple times and see newer things. Yeah, so you want to go on to 87? Yeah?
Maybe, we skipped almost the entire thing so far, but...
You want to go back to the beginning? Yeah, I don't know. No. I mean, I thought I just thought 86 was what Mia wanted to start with.
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a bad starting point because it talks about consciousness as process.
Yeah.
So maybe we can just begin.
Well, let's do something on determinate negation, maybe. Like in 79 even.
Okay.
Kind of sets up that process that we were just alluding to, right?
Well, he has a beautiful metaphor, first of all, on page 49, natural consciousness. That's probably a good starting point to go up to determinate negation, or negation to begin with. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, the concept of knowledge. Or in other words, not to be real knowledge. But since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, this path has a negative significance for it. And what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does not lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, as the way of despair. This is a very beautiful metaphor, I think, and something that you can think through throughout this introduction and really throughout the whole phenomenology, the pathway of doubt, and skepticism.
Right.
Yep.
And consciousness is agony, basically,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The agony of despair, yes. Yeah. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used. Shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to that truth again after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. No, on the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge. Here we go with Kant. For which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it is prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's own deed as what is true.
This kind of goes back to that introduction we did with Kant, right, on enlightenment.
Yes, it does.
As maturity, I guess.
Yes, part of the maturity, yes. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is in reality the detailed history, and this is your Kant as well, of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science, even though he is going further than, for him, the Hegelian moment is the education of consciousness, the Bildung, right? And the education of Bewusstsein in that Bildung, in that image cultural formation. Whereas in Kant, it's a maturity, right? There's an immaturity that you're releasing in a way, right? That zealous resolve represents this education simplistically as something directly over and done with in the making of the resolution, but the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution, in contrast to the untruth of that view. Now, following one's conviction, of course, more than giving oneself over to authority, and this is very good in terms of authority and confrontation, right? But changing an opinion accepted on authority into an opinion held out of personal conviction does not necessarily alter the content of the opinion or replace error with truth. The only difference being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction and being caught up in one based on the authority of others lies in the added conceit that is innate in the latter position. The skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit, for the first time, competent to examine what truth is. For it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, the thoughts, opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's, ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straightaway is still filled and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. So this is an interesting, attempt, to go through what does it mean to educate consciousness, and what kind of despair and anxiety is really, involved in this, right? And how does one overcome authority? You don't just overcome authority by just saying bullshit or, that's wrong. You do so through great anxiety and questioning, and this is going on in the question of the education of consciousness, right? And then it becomes something different, right? Than just a anti-authoritarian, moment.
And the authority that he's sort of taking on, I think, is kind of the empiricism and the way rationalism reinforce each other.
Yeah, he's taking on, the whole tradition and Schelling's, authority, transcendental idealism.
Yeah.
This German idealism also means transcendental idealism, Hegelian idealism, and really ultimately Hegelian materialism. So yes, so transcendental idealism is being taken on here too, and how knowledge is constituted, right, in this regard. So there is a conversation always with Kant and always with Schelling going on, in between the spaces, right?
Right.
Okay, so and then this is interesting because he'll go back again to the unreal, the necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of the unreal consciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. To make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness and its untruth is not merely a negative procedure. This is interesting. How does one unmask, in our vocabulary, false consciousness, if you want to look at it that way? Yep. Ideology.
Yeah, exactly.
Another one here. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it, and a knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness which occurs on the road itself and will manifest itself in due course. This is just the skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness in its result and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. For it is only when it is taken as the result of that from which it emerges, that is, in fact, the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Okay? The skepticism that ends up with a bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness cannot get any further from there, but must wait to see whether something new comes along, what it is, in order to throw it too into the same empty abyss. But when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely as a determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in the negation, the transition is made through, which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about of itself. Okay, you want to make a comment on that, or?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I wonder how we talk about this.
It made me think like, I mean, in like a psychoanalytic way, it's kind of like a symptom isn't just like a mistaken idea. It's like a mistaken idea that like expresses like simultaneously like the truth of a specific system. So even if that system is untrue, like you have to like grasp the like way that it like functions like systematically in order to understand like what it is as a specific kind of like mistake.
Yeah, I mean, you're onto something there. I mean, first of all, negation does not mean negative, right, in Hegel. Negation is really a function not to cancel something out, right, to say, but to put into opposition to the non-being, right? This is what's really going on here when he uses these terms of nothingness or out of nothing, right, in a sense. And then the now is also put into its opposite. So you have a now time that is allowing you to get to the level of how the negation becomes determinate. So you need the now, the temporal now, in order to undergo this process. So what you're talking about in terms of the psychoanalytic situation, the now becomes the understanding of the function of that system, to which you're, engaged with, right? Yeah. The new form begins to arise.
So,
this is the production,
the processes,
new forms, the processes that produce new forms, but you need the now and you need the opposition. It's not so much just the negation as a negativity, right? The negation itself is not a canceling out of something. It is,
So what? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
What is the opposition that he's putting right here? Like, can you speak a little more about that?
Well, it's in the next paragraph.
Right.
Okay? I mean, if we go forward, the goal is not necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression, right? It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. Hence, this process, or the process towards this goal, is also unhalting, and short of it, no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot by its own efforts go beyond its immediate existence, but it is driven beyond it by something else, and this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits, and since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. Okay? So you're always, in this process of the beyond, right? You never really reach it. Okay? You never really reach. So you're always, in this process, if you will, of the beyond something. Not as infinity, but the beyond that cannot, which leaves open the possibility always for further abstractions and dialectical unfolding of the spheres. So in some ways, after we get through the sense certainty, the instruments, the medians, the 0 point, the sense data of mediation, and we begin to show this as, theoretically unfoundable, but empirically there, right? This is what he does. We begin to enter into a new sphere of perception, right?
A deeper understanding.
A deeper, and then we're going to go on to the major break, which is force and understanding. Right? So these spheres are unfolding always, but it requires, again, if you will, the requirement, the prerequisite is always this. You know, that's where the determination is. The famous saying, all determination est negatio. All determination is negation.
Yeah.
This is Spinoza. This is where Hegel's starting point is in philosophy. All determination is negation. But the negation does not necessarily mean just this canceling out. Remember, this is, again, it's not to cancel, but it's to put into opposition something, right? And this opposition is between the now being now into its opposite. Right? So you have the movement, you know, to put this in more ontological terms, the movement of being and nothingness.
Right. So, so it's the contradiction. You're saying, you know, there's two elements, for instance, right? And it's not that one cancels each other out, but the notion, or I guess the knowledge, or the concept in our sense, holds them together, produces a new object, something beyond just the immediate negation.
A new form.
Right.
A new form.
A new form.
Yes, a new form. Okay. A new gestalt, if you will. Right?
Okay.
The objects are there, and it's hey Phil, how you doing?
Yeah.
The objects are already there, right? Mm-hmm. And as you were saying, are altered, you know, in the passage you wanted to look at earlier.
Right.
But in this case, we're producing new forms, right? So in some ways, this is very close, if you will, to part of the processes of the radical imagination.
Right.
You know, why would the imagination, which is productive in Kant, we would just be producing new forms. But in the radical imagination, the break is always taking place, right? In this determinate negation. This is what produces the new form, right? In going forward, so that we do not get caught in the eternal recurrence of the same old forms, or the repetition of the same old forms.
Or the new concept, right?
Or the new concept, if we get to that level, yes.
Right,
because the imagination and the concept are different, at least in the beginning, right? Yeah, we can lead to that.
That's
you kind of understand? I mean, you know, you're breaking up the objects. You have to get out of the I object world here and kind of think of this as, you know, you're moving in from nothingness, right, in a oppositional moment with the being of a new form, right? And you're kind of on that highway that he uses, this path of despair that's going on.
I think, you know,
and the interesting thing, you know, just to go back for a second, you know, in psychoanalytic terminology, you know, anxiety is always related to inhibitions and symptoms, right? In many ways, and it's situational in many senses and unconscious. But in Hegel, the anxiety, and in existential vocabulary, anxiety reveals nothing. You know, the object of anxiety is nothingness.
Right.
It's not fear of an object, right? Anxiety has no object. So this is very important to keep in mind. I think this will help you if you kind of make that distinction between angst and Furt, right? That you can have fear of an object, you know, you have fear of certain repetitious traumas and this kind of stuff, but that the anxiety itself has no object, which is why it's so overwhelming and so fearful. Go ahead, Josh, I'm sorry.
I just thought it was, you
We're
know...
looking at the introduction in the Phenomenology, 89, section 89. So.
Okay. Are we on 89?
Yeah.
Oh, no,
well, we were, yeah. 89, 90, yeah. So, not page 89, proposition 80, I'm
80.
sorry. Yeah, sorry.
But I think, you know, what you were saying is that it goes beyond the limit, and I think that limit is important because, to me, I was reading this as a limit of reason, ultimately, as well, you know, this Kantian notion.
It's a limit of Kantian reason.
Right.
Yes,
that
not
we can't
Hegelian.
know the in itself.
Right.
And see, that's the important part, because here, with the determinate negation, we can get to the in itself, ultimately.
Right.
And
we
so,
can get to the Kantian vocabulary, the Neuemmel realm.
Right.
There's no such thing as the quote-unquote unknowable realm.
Right.
In this sense. Right?
I think
because again, we have a science of knowing. Right? This Wissenschaften, this grasping, will goes towards absolute knowledge, right? This is his, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty ambitious. I mean, I Hegel of God, right? I Hegel of God. Yeah, I am the absolute knowing subject. I, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. I sit on the throne of Charlemagne.
It brings back the notion of freedom ultimately, though.
What's that? I'm sorry?
It brings back freedom that we can actually know, that we can aspire to know, to go to something beyond our limit.
It opens up the freedom of knowing, yes,
right.
Absolutely. And it also, what he always is doing here is also staying within the social context. It's not like this is so abstract that it's eternal, right? He's not really dealing, I mean, he's recapitulating many things, but again, this is preparatory, these first 3 chapters. We're doing the introduction, sense, certainty, perception, force, and understanding as 3 propedeutic chapters before we get into consciousness, right? Until we come to consciousness here with Hegel. Yeah. So you have to remember this is again a historical move by him in order to confront the empiricists, Hume, right? Bishop Berkeley in perception, right? As well as, the Kantian transcendental apperception. These are all things that are going on, and I'm sorry, we should have more history of philosophy, but I'm throwing out these terms. But these are the things he's, markers, if you will.
Right.
If you want to look at it as some analytical philosophers would say indexicals, but really just markers for us that, transcendental apperception, right? Empirical objects, Hume's skepticism, before objects and sense data is all over the sense certainty here. All over, right? Yeah, in a way. And how we empirically, don't know. It's not knowledge to Hegel. How we perceive is not knowledge either. And he goes through all these steps in these chapters. These are the new characters, if you will, right? Or the new chapter headings, if you will, if you want to, again, look at this as a novel. But sense, certainty, perception, and force and understanding are all part of this propedeutic till we get to Bewusstsein, consciousness, the main leading role in this drama towards, absolute knowing. Right?
Yeah.
It's a science, again, I keep emphasizing this, the science of the Erfahrung of consciousness, the Wissenschaften der Erfahrung der Bewusstsein. And in English it sounds kind of pale, but really in German it's extremely strong, extremely strong, the Wissenschaften of the experience of consciousness, the traveling along of consciousness.
I think it's an incredibly powerful idea because it, so often I think we're made to feel that when we don't know something, that it's a problem for us. It's I never want to reveal that I don't know anything because I look stupid in front of everybody.
Right.
But in fact, in this way, you have to not know. You have to have this feeling of violence and anxiety, retreat from the truth, no peace, to actually gain knowledge.
Right.
And if it's a much more open relationship to knowledge, I think, than we typically have in other sort of strategies or systems of knowing,
Right.
I think that's great.
I mean, if you think of this also, look, if you think of this as system of knowing, as you just pointed out, a system of knowing, this is really what's going on, at a very fundamental level, without the presuppositions of our natural consciousness. What he's really trying to take away, and why it's so hard, and it's very difficult for anybody, that's coming to this first time, second time, third time, really, always difficult, Hegel. But the thing is that right now you're in a position in this book, right, of natural consciousness. You're not in consciousness or self-consciousness yet. This is where we are. We're in natural consciousness. which to Hegel, again, is propedeutic. He's describing the natural consciousness of sense certainty, the empirical, right? The natural consciousness of perception and a perceiving subject, right? The natural concept of getting force, and then the break into understanding, and understanding becomes kind of like the lever on which, you know, we make the move to consciousness, to Bewusstsein. Does that, I mean, that kind of help a little bit? I mean, you know, that's a descriptive element of the natural consciousness, right? So, I mean, you know, we don't really even have natural consciousness in this culture right now, much less consciousness. I mean, you know, it's pretty amazing when you really think about this in terms of the new homo datum, the sense data, you know, and what's going on in sense certainty. We're lucky if most people live in this realm, right here, at the 0 point of phenomenology. Very lucky. Yeah. I mean, I hate to say I'm reading a book into the world, but I think it's
before that.
What's that? I'm sorry?
Well, if they're not there, what's before that?
It's ideology, like fixed form.
Well, this is ideology at work, all of this, in a sense. Yeah, what's before that is,
or nothing, homo economicus, or like you said.
Well, homo economicus, yeah, we're so far away from homo faber, man the maker,
right.
You know, savoir faire. We don't know how to live anymore, you know, etc. Yeah. I watch people on the subway. Everybody's like this. When I come on the C train, bunched up. Everybody on their screens. Everything. Yeah. So anyway, Anyway, I mean, so let's just look at crucial terms. So in 78, education of consciousness from the standpoint of science. This is a crucial term, I think. Right? Right?
What is that?
Right? The skepticism, page 50. Skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. Right? It brings around the state of despair about the so-called natural ideas, the thoughts and opinions, regardless of whether they're called one's own or someone else's, idea with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straight away is still filled and hampered, that is, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. Okay? So it's very, very interesting. Right? Very interesting. It's still incapable, right? And these natural ideas, thoughts, opinions, etc., ideas with which consciousness sets about the examination of truth straight away, still filled and hampered. It's incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. So the impossible really to know at this level, right? Of the skepticism. Of the skepticism.
Which is the entire history of philosophy up until this point.
Something like that. I mean, he's looking at this at many, many levels. I mean, it's many, many levels, yes. I mean, remember again, I know we're not, I mean, look, we're only reading one work of his. Yeah. You know, this is a crucial work, in my opinion. I think this is, to my mind, this is the most dynamic of all the works. You know, with the phenomenology, he begins with, you know, he's going to begin with pure knowing, whereas in the logic he begins with pure being. So, you know, he does flesh this out later ontologically. You know, you can say the phenomenology of spirit is really much more of an epistemological work, right, whereas the science of logic is much more of the ontological work.
That's interesting.
I mean, just to look at it that way. Or a cross-fertilization between epistemology and ontology. Right. One being 1807, one much later. You know, not much later, but later. Yeah?
Yeah, right? That's good.
And, yeah, I mean, so very, 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 very important to keep, you know, to really keep this in mind, that the phenomenology is really about the thinking, if you will, or the beginning is really about speculative philosophy. This is really what's going on here, right? It's the examination of the kind of thinking that we find in sensation, in sense certainty, right? And then we'll talk about this more in a second. I do want to, again, I want you to see that one begins with pure being, the logic, and this begins with the presuppositionalist, pure knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important. You think about it as process always. You think about how you're processing it, etc. You're going to really get somewhere. And again, with the goal of getting to the question of coming to consciousness of how do we know, after we've stripped away all the presuppositions of our knowing, right? Through our senses, our sense data, the way we perceive things, and the way we traditionally have understood things. Yeah?
Yeah.
And the is and the is not is always playing out dialectically. It both is and is not. This is Zizek's ability, because he's got a very good dialectical mind. He sees both the is and the is not, and why he can, do what he does. He has that very gifted, ability, which comes out of, I think, very serious reading of Hegel for many, many years, that he's able to see both the is and the is not. He doesn't do genealogy. He's not a Nietzschean in that way. He's not a Deleuzian, where you're looking at energy and energy flows and processes only of becoming, right? He's thinking through dialectical formal operations as well as, the dialectics of, in process, right? And this is always a problem we have in the United States, once again, in academia, in the school systems, that no one is trained this way. If you know people from Eastern Europe that came up in the Polish system, or in, some of the other, in Yugoslavia back in the day, they think dialectically. They're very, very good at this. They think dialectically. Because they're trained this way early on. It's not the best of the dialectics, the most imaginative, but it's good enough, right? Yeah. Better, because they had to open up. Yeah, tell us.
You can write a book on good enough dialectics.
Yes, good enough dialectics. There you go. Another one to do. Right.
So I think
just
going
ahead,
back to this, the
please,
negation and the negation. I think this section 82 is kind of interesting because it says the truth is being in itself. So the truth is always what's the surplus of the object, or of the
Where
object
is this
itself.
now? You're on
82.
Proposition 82?
Yeah. This being is at the top of the page. This being in itself is called truth.
Right. He's looking at this in a relation, right? And keep that in mind. We must distinguish this being for another from being in itself, right? Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it and posited as existing outside this relationship.
Yeah.
This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here, since our object is phenomenal knowledge. Its determinations will at first be taken directly as they present themselves, and they do present themselves very much as we have already apprehended them. So again, he's looking at what's being phenomenalized, right?
Yeah.
The structure of appearance, right? Again, phenomenology that ultimately will be the science of the experience of seeing the phenomena, how this plays out, under the great auspices of the world historical spirit, the Geist. So what were we going to say about this? I'm sorry.
I mean, this section is where he sort of introduces the interplay between the in itself and the for itself.
Right.
Essentially.
Right.
And then I think I thought that one line was kind of interesting because it sort of posits that truth stands outside or opposed to consciousness, ultimately, in the object. The being in itself is called truth,
Right.
think that's, I don't know, I mean, well, I'm sure we'll pick that up later, but I thought that was an interesting moment just in this.
Am I misreading that to think that that could also be a critique of Kant, like that this noumenal realm,
Yes.
of the being in itself is what is true? And he's saying that's not what's true necessarily. It's like the relational is true.
The relational is always true. That's good.
And that's the
good.
object.
That's the process. The relational process is really where you have to think, rather that you've got to the fixity of an essence,
Right.
or that the for itself, in itself, dialectic stops at the in itself. It's going to go back to the for itself. This is always the movement. And one of the great things in relationships, human relationships, done on this is Sartre's critique, or his section, concrete relations with others in being and nothingness, where he really looks at this in terms of the gaze. I think Lacan took a lot from Sartre he acknowledges occasionally, but took a lot from concrete relations with others in terms of the four fundamental concepts when he does things with the gaze. And remember, I wanted to point this out. I was going to bring a copy tonight. I'll bring it next week. Merleau-Ponty's great philosophical work is called The Phenomenology of Perception. So this is a very Hegelian work as well, in which he's going to look at perception, through the Husserlian, because perception becomes primary in Husserlian phenomenology, whereas in Hegelian phenomenology, it's ultimately going to be reason and the dialectic of reason that becomes primary at the end, right? So this is something to keep in mind, as we go forward, that, of the three H's, if you will, we have the three M's, Marx, Marcuse, and Mao. We have the three H's, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger. Husserl and Hegel are both dealing with phenomenology in different ways, in many ways, right? Yeah, and consciousness. For Husserl, consciousness is always intentionality. Right? In Hegel, as you said, it's much more relational. It's a really good term to think about, that the Aristotelian influence is very, very definite here in many ways, and it's a relational.
So could we say that object is maybe actually social relations? Could we substitute the term?
I want to make a distinction again with object and Gegenstand. So in German, again, to be fair to Hegel and to fair to the tradition, there's a word in German, object, which is what we normally say are objects in the world, right? That we constitute in consciousness, etc., right? And we see that are altered, etc. There's another kind of object which stands against us, Gegenstand. And I know you've read Heidegger's Was ist das Ding?
Yeah, you know where I'm going to
And
go.
the whole notion of Gegenstand is standing against. What, I'm sorry?
I said you know where I'm going to go then. Yeah.
Yeah. I hope.
But there's a better translation, and Heidegger makes this a very interesting point. I forget exactly the term that he uses, but it's to throw over to and against.
Let me just say
and
something.
The throwing over is very
the word
crucial.
object. Objects comes from abakio, right?
It's not just against. There's also movement there to throw over.
Abakio, I'm sorry. Iakio, which means to throw over, or throw out, right? That's where the word object comes from, right? You're objecting, you're throwing over something, right? Whereas the Gegenstand is standing against. It's oppositional.
Right.
Much more Hegelian. This is part of the dialectic,
Well, actually,
the oppositional. But go ahead, I'm listening.
In Heidegger, it says that it's actually Kant who redefines the word object to be Gegenstand, and that there's an earlier version that actually captures the.
I agree with that. Yeah.
The scholastic notion of to throw over that's misplaced in Kant's redefinition of object as Gegenstand. It's a very interesting section. We reviewed this at your house at one point, I remember.
Yeah, I know, we went over it, I remember, yeah. Abekio, I think it's A-B, I'll look it up in the Latin, I'm misspelling it, I'm
So
sorry.
which one is Hegel using when he's...
Hegel's using both,
Yeah.
and as is Kant. They're using both.
Okay.
But the thing is, in contradiction, that stands, Gegenstand stands against, is the much more the moment of the tension of the dialectic, whereas the object is much more easier to constitute. So you can say in perception, we have object more, right? But once we get to understanding and contradiction, we're going to begin to see the Gegenstand, okay? If that makes, somewhat, practical sense to all of this, right? The Gegenstand, this is a very crucial distinction. In both Kant and in Hegel, Kant is right. Heidegger rethinks Kant in terms of this Gegenstand is the first to come up with this, but Hegel uses it in terms of the force of contradiction, right? And in understanding, right? And we're going to see this. And then in the master-slave or in lordship and bondage, we're going to be seeing this too. It's not only the object of the master interiorizing and needing the slave, or the slave that interiorizes and reinteriorizes the master that's going on in that dialectic, but then it's also the opposition, the really strong, moment of the Gegenstand that is the face-off and the risk towards death, which most don't risk. They will not take that risk. When Aronowitz says, we have to have a new generation of lawbreakers, he's basically talking about the inability of the left to take risks, right? In many ways, except for a few. And then, probably the lawbreakers are always just at the demonstration lines and not in a way that's risking even more, right? In a sense, because if
would you count like black bloc people and stuff like that as like taking risks?
Well, not to my politics, but
right, they're more like this anarchist thing, right?
Yeah, not to my politics so much. I think they heard more. I mean, Phil could comment on this. He's more engaged in that.
More performative.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a performative.
Rather than
drama and the theater of
the theater of anarchy is more the stake than the actual penetrating or dislocating the system.
The feeling of doing something.
Yeah. I mean, really what Deleuze says we're always looking for new weapons is a much more concentrated attempt at Gegenstand and, kind of going through that in a way. But you have to remember, listen, Hegel is a thinker of contradiction. This is a major part of the force of his dialectic. It's not only the negation of the negation, and you can see the beginning of the transformation of quantity into quality. You begin to see this as you work through this, but the real moment of the dialectic for him is the force of contradiction, right? Dialectical contradictions, etc. And which is one of the reasons I think that Marx read him so carefully in a certain way and said he's a dead dog, but he went back to him. And the most Hegelian influence of Marx, Hegel, when Marx, was writing the Grundrisse, so this is the most Hegelian influence on Marx, in my opinion, outside of the 1844 manuscript. There's a 15-year period where Marx is hardly looking at Hegel. At all. Right? But it goes back to him when he's beginning to construct the notebooks on money and capital, which we have as the Grundrisse, the 1857 to 1858 notebooks, which are about 1,000 pages. And you see it in the introduction. You want a really good Hegelian Marxist thing in method, read the introduction to the Grundrisse. Those pages on the totality. Because again, what we're really trying to get to here is beyond just the thought concrete, we're trying to get to the social totality. We're trying to look at these things. And as I mentioned before, the thinkers that think this through, Kojève, who basically manhandles Hegel and transforms him into Marx in a way, or a mix of Marx and Heidegger in the 33 to 39 lectures, of course saw it in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, right? Very Hegelian in their approach, and obviously Lukács in the classic seminal essay, Reification and Class Consciousness of the Proletariat, in terms of intellectual documents on the left. These are three seminal works of Hegelian approaches.
What was the lectures that Adorno gave on dialectics?
He gave several. He gave the introduction to dialectics in the 50s, and then he gave lectures on the negative dialectics, which was different,
Right.
which is one of his most difficult books. Because in that, he is engaging what Josh was talking about, not only determinate negation, but also the negation of the negation and the labor of the negative. Yeah, in many ways. Now, Adorno is probably the most, at least to my mind, to my knowledge, the most Hegelian of the negative dialecticians. The most positive dialectician out of the Hegelian social totality is on the other side, Ernst Bloch. One thinks through utopia, the principle of hope, in 3 volumes. The other is thinking through Samuel Beckett, that we're in endgame and we're, basically all walking wounded. Right? Yeah, in many
What do you
ways.
think?
Damn it. What's that? I'm sorry?
I said, what do you think?
What do I think? I'm sort of in between. I'm mediated between those two of the Frankfurt School. Yeah. I think without a category, for Adorno, praxis is writing.
Right.
You make your mark as a writer.
Yeah.
Basically as a theorist, in a way. I still have too much of the praxis and activity in mind. I really think that unless we think about overturning always, beyond that of just the writing, we're kind of lost.
Right.
I understand the desire, right? In terms of, I was having this conversation with Arto after his father died, that really in a way, for a radical, life has meaning because you're caught up in the revolutionary spirit. If you have revolutionary consciousness, you don't really care about getting meaning from some supernatural force or out of, your little petty relationships or stuff like that. The meaning is much greater. It's to go back to a term of yours, beyond. Very beyond. So I think if we think this way, we make something else. We have to think that horizon, I would think, is really the major.
Where would you put Horkheimer in that?
Well, Horkheimer was really brilliant in the early days. His early texts on materialism philosophy, the latest attack on metaphysics is a great work we were talking about a little bit yesterday in terms of logical positivism and this attack on metaphysics. Really good because we had that discussion last night. He again, the Institute was supposed to really do research that would, be oriented towards freedom, and he was, in a way, he wrote beautiful stuff, in the back of Situations. We have one thing that he did write about being a professional revolutionary, what that really meant. How you do not expect anything from the society that you're living in. No kudos, no recognition, no accolades. And look at Sartre, rejects the Nobel Prize. In a way, it's a bourgeois prize. He rejects it. So you have these characters, right, that really lived it in so many ways. So but it's hard to play because Horkheimer, kind of faded. He stayed with the Institute. He had it, but he got caught up with the Yellow Peril a little bit late in his life, and but he was still there. Yeah, he was.
Is that like anti-Asian?
He had a primal horde experience.
That's too bad.
The German saw Mao, I guess. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know. But But
I bought the critical...
Benjamin, very creative as a writer and very free. You can really kind of put these people, I don't like to totally categorize them, but to me, Heidegger's the most violent thinker and creative violent thinker of the 20th century. Adorno is the most quote-unquote intellectual intelligent. Lukács is the greatest activist theorist, right? Gramsci could have been if he had not been in jail, given his constitution and his thinking. And then, of course, Benjamin is the most creative. But Benjamin is incredibly creative if you read his stuff carefully. Philosophy, the Arcades Project, all these things. Pretty amazing. And he understood that if you really want to understand, I think there are two things the left always fails in. Children's toys and books, never really looks at this concretely, right? And sports. These two factors, they don't really engage in terms of social phenomena.
That's true.
They may talk about sports a little bit, and you get a Dave Zirin out there that'll do the stuff, but to me, there's no understanding of how dominant it is. And then also, what games are children playing, right? What are their toys, etc., that you understand a culture much better.
What were some communist games?
What's that?
What were the communist sports? I guess they did the Olympics, right?
Well, they
Track and field.
yeah.
I don't know.
Great weightlifting, wrestling.
Wrestling.
I have a communism for kids book at my house. I don't know.
It's called Communism for Kids.
It's a children's book.
What kind of book?
It's a children's book. I think I found it on the street in Park Slope or something.
That's the place to find things on the street. Yeah. Got it. Yeah. So anyway, but going back to this influence of Hegel, I mean, it's massive. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, this is so much played out, throughout the 20th century and really into where we're going now. I mean, part of the problem is how do you take a look at the New World Order, after, Fukuyama is one aspect of this, who really thought that the end of history was triumphal of capitalism, right? That 1989, was the beginning of the New World Order.
Tina.
What's that, I'm sorry?
Tina.
Well, Tina before that.
Yeah.
Even years before that, that was preparatory.
Yeah.
The no alternative. That was the code to make sure that the Soviet Union would not make it through the decade.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, you guys know the story that Reagan promised Gorbachev an emergency loan, and at the 11th hour pulled it, and that was the end of, any possibility of the Soviet Union surviving. Yeah.
I never heard that.
Yeah. Yeah. Multiple billions of dollars were promised. And it turned into whatever they put in power after Gorbachev, a drunk. Completely subjected to Washington, in a sense. And that breakup, took away at least a sign of an opposition, right? After that, it was just free, You had one moment that was of international significance in terms of world mobilization, which was Seattle.
Which?
Seattle, the World Trade Uprising, remember 1999, I think it was, right? 99, yeah. And, of course, what comes along after that? 9/11. It diffused a lot of this, in so many ways.
All of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, the anti-war march had no effect. The Iraq anti-war march never really fulfilled anything. I was telling Eloy, who comes to the class, he comes on Saturday and Mondays, that in Montreal it was very colorful. I went to both demonstrations here. It was a barricade march, right? Basically the police determined the march here in New York, whereas in Montreal it's free, people were out, subways all over downtown marching freely, costumes, very, very different kind of, festivities.
Yeah, well, here they kept it out of Central Park. They kept it.
Made sure, yeah.
Yeah,
And look what they do with climate change. You start with 350.org with McKibben and company, and you put them on 10th Avenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, that march was like a joke.
Yeah, you went?
Yeah, just to be like, what is this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean the strategy of the authorities here is to make it as miserable as possible.
Right.
And
So demeaning, like walking down 10th Avenue, like.
yeah.
And that, bring it back to the Hegel too, like, it's the same as Marcuse that we were reading in Stanley's class, who completely lost the ability for negative thinking.
Yes, there's no negative thinking because people are afraid of negation.
Yeah.
Right. The negative thinking, your negativity is a canceling.
Right.
When someone says you're being negative, you can say, well, I'm just canceled. I'm not really just canceling.
Right.
Negation is very different than just canceling out. Yeah. So this is important to point out to people, because everybody gets accused, if you do any kind of critical theory, right, of being negative. This is always the accusation, the label that is attached to you. You're too negative. Don't you see any positive there? Etc. In order to get dialectically to the positive, you have to go through the negative, the labor of the negative. This is really a Hegelian moment. Unless you go through the labor of the negative, in which, the dark night, if you will, of the soul, to put it in more religious language, it's it's impossible to come out on the other side by just saying, I'm going to switch this to a positive attitude, or coach, I got a positive attitude today, I'm ready to do the calisthenics and the workout, or some nonsense like that.
And you never qualitatively get to a new term or a new concept without the negative.
No, exactly.
So all of the positivism just leads incrementally to nothing, really.
Right.
Or the same old.
Yeah. I mean, less than zero, one of Zizek's, the book, right? The less than zero is very, very important. That's part of the labor of the negative. So let me just point out another thing about the overarching here. The processes of knowing is really the lumiere, the light, right? This is the light, the clearing. Whereas the other part of the light is not the lens that diffuses the light. So think of this always. It's never through the lens. It's the light itself, right? It's the knowing, right? So this is a very different thing too. It allows you to see maybe in a different way. You're not seeing through lens, right? Again, the light.
It's like a more pure.
Yes.
Yeah, without the in the instrument.
Right. And the Wissenschaften, again, the process of accomplishing the knowing. That's the process of accomplishing the knowing.
I like that too.
The perfection of the process of accomplishing the knowing. The accomplishment of the knowing. Okay. So, what else in the introduction? In some ways, again, I have some notes here. I don't have any idea what these refer to. This is, from 25, 30 years ago. But I have one thing: is truth, the method, right? And I have on the side here at the end of the introduction. And anyway, I have all kinds of,
Right. Should we be thinking about truth?
Right.
So maybe it's more about process and not about the truth. Yes. In the Marxist terms, in a way.
Right. Yeah, and he mentions Proposition 88, where we've been talking about, the necessity, the formal aspect of the context of pure origination. For it, what is thus arisen, exists only as an object. For us, it appears at the same time as movement and a process of becoming. This is very important, this movement, again, going back to where you started today. Mm-hmm. I think this supplements that nicely. The for it and versus the for us, right? And that movement is the same time as movement and a process of becoming. And because of this necessity, the way to science is itself. Already science, the beginning, right? Because he wants to look for the beginning. And hence, in virtue of its content, is the science of the experience of consciousness. And the experience of consciousness is obviously this movement of the for us, right? And the for it, right?
And it says behind the back. I liked that part.
Yeah,
yes,
it's super
behind
important.
the back. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Althusser brings that up all the time.
Well, he likes behind the back. Yeah.
And it's a Freudian notion too, right?
Yes, absolutely. And behind the back, Marx's history takes place behind the back.
Yeah.
Right. Of the capitalists. Marx uses this phrase multiple times.
And really, that's the process of concept formation is essentially without the ideology behind the back, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. The distinction here that's going on is science versus ideology.
Right.
Really what's going on. These are all considered not philosophy. This is ideology.
Yeah.
Right? This is when Sartre, in Search for a Method, for example, says there are no philosophies, there are only ideologies. We don't have a true Marxist theory. He's really riffing off of Hegel. The ideology of sense certainty, the ideology of sense data, empirical experience, right? 7, the ideology of perception. That's the way you perceive things. You know how this goes, how this reduces itself so many times to relativism, etc., right? That's just your understanding of the moment, right? Those are just your forces at play. I'm making cliches out of it every day, but it really is what Hegel's doing in here is really demystifying the ideology. So think of this in terms of a tension always going on in this book between science as Wissenschaften versus that of ideology, right? In German too, right? Yeah, the ideas
Yeah,
versus concepts. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, it's especially, it's a little bit confusing in that,
It's more than a little confusing, but anyway, I'm just kidding you.
No, our science,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
the science that's portrayed as science in this society is
Right.
Cartesian science.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
So it's kind of, when he starts talking about science, he's really talking about something else.
Well, the Cartesian is skeptical of this, as we know, of sense certainty. This is the Cartesian moment, is to be very skeptical because the senses will always deceive us.
Right.
The Cartesian model is really mind, right? Separated from body or any kind of, sensory data that will have a tendency to deceive us. Yeah. But yes, it set up this dualism in science and this kind of positivity towards certainty. Yes. Descartes was very humble in the sense that he wanted to be considered a doctor. That he was really leaving, mankind. And he studied Harvey on the blood. These are very interesting figures once you delve into them more. Just not the theories that we can kind of push out and criticize, but he studied Harvey on the circulation of the blood, right? And he really wanted to make his work extremely close to medicine and and science, right? With mathematical precision. He wanted certainty. He didn't want probability. And some, yeah. So, and he's also the birth of modern consciousness. So, in a lot of ways, this is the beginning of the ego. This is the beginning of the subject. This is the beginning of a radical skepticism, too. The only thing we cannot doubt is ourself as thinking. But again, Hegel wants to get outside of that kind of subjectivity.
Yeah.
That's another antagonist he has here, and it's certainly a formidable one, because everybody talks about subjectivity. Well, subjectivity is born with Luther in Germany and Descartes in France. These are the two modern, philosophers, if you will. And Luther's not really, but he did, begin with the German concept of subjectivity, right? And, the Cartesian moment of the ego. So this is important to keep in mind, that Hegel's going after this as well, And when people talk about subjectivity so easily, that in some ways, I'm not so sure Hegel has that subjectivity ultimately at the end. This was a critique that Soren Kierkegaard leveled at him, that Lacan is very aware of, that Hegel figured out everything out except the question of he left man out of the system. Right, which is interesting, out of the system.
But to your point, Phil, too, the Wissenschaften is this idea of theory or systematized knowledge.
Yeah, it's theory.
And that's the same, in the same sense you can say that maybe Althusser used the same term when he was saying science. Science is theory, essentially, for Althusser in a way also. Maybe you can make the case maybe against.
Well, Marx's science of history, there's only one science, and that is of history.
Right.
Althusser is making a point about the Wissenschaften of history. This is Marx's radical discovery. Right. The other sciences, of course, Thales with mathematics, and Galileo with physics, the modern physics, of which you have philosophical law and responses to, from Plato to Aristotle vis-a-vis Thales, and the Ionian school, and then of course you have Descartes all the way through Hegel, So, yeah, this is important. I mean, one way of, again, taking up a book like this and kind of unfolding it in terms of, the influences that it has, the master-slave dialectic is the epistemological questions are all in the first three sections: sense, certainty, perception, and force and understanding. For the epistemologists, this is where the concentration is. For the revolutionaries, in one part of the revolutionaries, the task is the master-slave dialectic, right? How are we going to risk historically, the desire for freedom versus slavery, right? And this plays out. For some of the other Marxists, such as Marcuse and Lukács, it's the question of reason and revolution. So observing reason, which follows the section on consciousness and self-consciousness, becomes another aspect of Marxist thought.
Maybe.
It's part of the Hegelian. So you can take a book like this, just like with Being in Time, and make it explode in many, many fields outside of itself, right?
Yeah.
But where's it starting? That's why these are good landmark texts, and I'll always say it's ridiculous only to read the contemporary because, if you're familiar with the Phenomenology of Spirit, the Critique of Pure Reason, Being in Time, you've got something really going, right? In the sense of figuring out a lot of the modern stuff. Philosophical investigations, of course, of Wittgenstein, and I'm sure you could also add, Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. But History and Class Consciousness is extremely derivative from these landmark texts, right? And especially Kant and Hegel. It's a long discussion with Marx, on this. Yeah.
It's a great book. Yeah.
So I think that this is, one reason to constantly go back and read this, etc. And also follow along this logic of that, sense certainty, the introduction again, the elimination of false starts, every beginning, right, is the beginning of a process which reveals itself for what it is only as it processes. Okay, so that may help you with the presupposition, only what is being processed, right, may be one way of looking at it. The determinations of conditions, how philosophy can be scientific, can only be the result, not the beginning of the philosophical system. So the result is always the beginning as well in Hegel. Anyway, right? And then this whole question of that we get to absolute knowing at the end, and that knowing is a light, not the lens through which the light is diffused or refracted, right? In some ways. Okay, let me just say a couple of things about sense certainty, right? First of all, in the sense certainty, do you want to go there? You want to
yeah. There was one thing that I wanted to say.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I thought, it was really cool.
We got about 25 minutes.
Just because of our Heraclitus the other day.
I like your drawings, like Marx, yeah.
You said,
elaborate stuff in the margins.
Here with the new pattern of consciousness comes on, it seems well, for which the essence is something different from what it is at the preceding stage.
I'm sorry, where were we at, Josh?
This is just in 87.
Okay.
In the middle of the paragraph.
Okay.
All right, what did I want to say about it? Let's read it. It is this fact that guides the entire series of patterns in consciousness in their necessary sequence, but it is just this necessity itself where the origination of a new object, it presents itself to consciousness with its understanding. How this happens just proceeds for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. But I thought it was interesting that there's this pattern of consciousness comes to the scene.
Right.
That it is this kind of Heraclitean rhythm that we were talking about of holding the contradiction, the unobvious. I think he says something, I can't remember exactly what he says, but holding the contradiction together as this sort of harmony in a sense.
Right.
I thought that was a very interesting sort of, parallel to this new pattern of consciousness, bringing that along.
Right. Interesting.
And then the new object too, in the new object.
Okay, yeah, interesting. In some ways, going back to Lukács, the whole notion of imputed class consciousness is also coming out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Class consciousness, history and class consciousness is actually riffing off this section
Yeah.
in many ways. The reversal of consciousness, right? Consciousness taking place behind the back
Right.
I didn't know that. I was unaware, etc. And this is interesting, again, in terms of the Hegelian aftermath, part of this course, the German idealism and its aftermath, right? Okay, good, all right. So, and then this whole thing behind the back of consciousness in that section on 87 as well, yeah? So, again, like I said, the introduction is very crucial to get us to a presuppositionalist philosophy, right? And you can, actually one way of ordering this in your mind is you can take in the preface and the introductions the sections that he deals with what philosophy is and how it's different in his view than other things. And you have many propositions. Maybe I'll just draw that up as a map. That's a kind of good map to deal with in terms of how he's engaging this. And then, of course, consciousness being the other thing. Philosophy, consciousness, right? Obviously, dialectics, movement, and this crucial term of the, for us versus the for it and the for us, the being in itself and the being for us, the movement of consciousness. So think always movement again.
Right.
Yeah, very much like you mentioned, the Heraclitean influence upon Hegel, that all things are flowing, right? The river is flowing differently all the time too. There's never the same river that we go into, right?
Right.
Twice, right? Etc. Okay, so consciousness, the section A, and this is really the beginning of the work, right? And he's going to begin with sense certainty, with empiricism. And sense certainty, or the this and meaning, right? So any thoughts or any things that really struck you here? He begins with, it's an examination of the kind of thinking that one finds in sensation as an adequate source of certainty. He's critiquing that, that kind of correspondence, right? Right? And it's the most immediate of all things. Nothing comes between it, right? So I just sense you in the room and that's it. There's no mediation of who you are, what you're, about, all these other levels and layers. It's just the immediate of sense data, etc. And then you become certain of this, right? Yeah. So he looks at this stage to a language examination, right? And so there are three moments here: the acts of uttering, the acts of meaning, and the acts of pointing out. Okay, so there are three moments here in the sense certainty where the stage, this hypothetical 0 point of mediation, is subjected to. The language, game, if you will. That of the acts of uttering, right? Acts of intention or meaning, minor, and then the pointing out, the thisness and the thatness, right? Yep. And this immediacy, its promise ultimately dissolves, right? Okay, so this is really, I think the thematic is that of the indifferent this, if you want a character, so to speak. The indifferent thisness of things, if you want to look at it that way, right? Okay, so he has these distinctions. 93 is crucial. It is not just we who make the distinction between essence and instance, between immediacy and mediation. On the contrary, we find it within sense certainty itself. And it is to be taken up in the form in which it is present there, not as we have defined it. One of the terms is posited in sense certainty in the form of a simple immediate being, or as the essence, the object. The other, however, is posited as what is unessential and mediated, something which in sense certainty is not in itself, but through the mediation of another. The I, a knowing which knows the object because the object is, while the knowing may not either be or not be, but the object is. It is what is true, or it is the essence. It is regardless whether known or not, and it remains, even if it is not known, whereas there's no knowledge if the object is not there. Again, the indifferent this, right? This object, right? So the question must therefore be considered whether in certainty itself the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be, whether this notion of it as the essence corresponds to the way it is present in sense certainty. To this end, we have not to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth, but only to consider the way in which it is present in sense certainty. How does the object appear to sense data or to sense certainty? Okay? So leave the I out of this, leave the reflections out of this. How does it present itself in the world? It is then, self-certainty itself must be asked, what is the this? And this is the main thing in Hegel. If we take this in the twofold shape of its being, as both the here and now, or as the now and here. Yeah. The dialectic it has in it will receive a form as intelligent as the this itself is. To the question, what is not now, let us answer, for example, now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment would suffice. We write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down, any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, we shall have to say that it has become stable. The now that is night is preserved, right? This is interesting, right? You know, yeah. As Faulkner once said, the past is not even past, right? Which is interesting, right? And it's aufhebend, it's preserved, right? It is treated as what it professes to be, as something that is, but it proves itself to be, on the contrary, something that is not. So you have the beginning of both the is and the is not when you're looking at objects in the world. This is a very crucial passage, you know, for Hegel, right? The now does indeed preserve itself, but as something that is not night. Equally, it preserves itself in the face of the day that now is, as something that is also not day, in other words, as a negative in general. And what Bruno did last night with the Magritte, this is not a pipe, this is another example of both the is and the is not at work. How Hegel would do this, right? In a way. Foucault does, I don't know if you know this is not a pipe.
Yeah, I
That's
see
the opposite, yeah.
in Chicago.
Yeah, okay, yeah. You've seen the painting itself.
Yeah.
Right. It's a very interesting text. It's worth looking at. You know, this is not a pipe. Very Hegelian like this, but this is Hegel at work, right? Okay, the self-preserving now is therefore not immediate, but it's mediated, right? So again, we're away from immediate self-certainty, right? For it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else, that vis-a-vis day and night, is not. As so determined, it is still just as simply now as before, and in this simplicity is indifferent to what happens in it. The indifferent this, again. Just as little as night and day or its being, just as much also it is the day and night. It is not in the least affected by this, its other being. A simple thing of this kind, which is, through negation, which is neither this nor that, the neither nor, not this, and is with equal indifference this as well as that, such a thing we call the universal. So in one paragraph here, on one section, 96, which I would put in my notes, you have both the definition of the universal in Hegel, the beginning, right? And the universal becomes the truth content of sense certainty, and you also have the is and the is not, you know, working dialectically, yeah? In this section 96 of sense certainty. Yeah. So, then he's going to go through the language games, right? It is a universal too that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, the universal this, or it is being in general. Of course, we do not envision the universal this or being in general, but we utter the universal. Okay? So the utterance is here. Right? In other words, we do not strictly say what in this sense certainty we must mean to say. But language, as we see, is the more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us to say ever to say or express in words, a sensuous being that we mean or that we intend. Very interesting, right?
So the language is at the center of sense certainty.
It is, yes. Not the house of being for Hegel, but language is the house of examination. Yeah, and very few people look at this. I mean, instead of the house of being that Heidegger calls it, or language, the unconscious is structured like a language, Lacan, the proposition could be, language, is the house of examination for Hegel. This is what we subject everything to. We subject it to language. And in this case, it's going to be through utterance and meaning.
And language works by universalizing.
Yes. We're going to talk about the universal, the particular, and the singular as we get further into this, of course, right? Yeah. And the pointing out, right? The indexicals, the language game that Wittgenstein, has this great example in the first part of that he got when he was visiting Russia. The 5 slabs. What the 5 slabs means. He was very taken by industrialization. He went to the Soviet Union in 1937, I think. Very impressed with the phase of industrialization, or the last of that period of the next 5-year plan or whatever. Stalinist industrialization. And he came back and he put in the index, the pointing out the 5 slabs of the laborer doing the construction job. And what that meant. 5 slabs, putting slabs on the building, slabs of concrete on the building. Yeah. It's very, in some ways. So this was a pointing out. So you have the utterance, right? The utterance, right? And in Bakhtin's case, the theory of the utterance, the difference between, the signal and the sign. In the utterance, we have the sign. Right? And signaling is just another thing, right? And then, of course, the meaning, the intention, right? In the universal, and then, of course, the pointing out, right? So he's going to go through this vis-a-vis this indifferent this. Right?
Yeah.
Indifferent this.
And language is the limit, becomes the limit.
Yes, the limit for examination. I call it the house of, I'm just playing, the house of examination, if you will, for Hegel. We're going to examine these things through language, etc. Now is the night, right? Well, not really.
Right? It doesn't work.
Right, it doesn't work. Yeah. So he's got it, and this is something, look, this is where it really becomes interesting. Stream of consciousness, techniques in modernist fiction, from Faulkner to Joyce and others, all of these things are coming out of these kind of, propositions. Not that they studied Hegel or read Hegel that much. But anyway, this was in the air and was part of, quote, the world spirit of art and form, etc. that was going on. Yeah, later. Yeah. You really think about this. And Beckett, I'll go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. One of his famous propositions. That's dialectical, very dialectical. I'll go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. Right? In a way. It's a positive dialectic, and I hope Baju said that when he talked about the affirmative dialectic when he gave the talk last week. I'll have to find out. Did you go? Or,
No, but I think Andrew has a recording.
Oh, he did? Okay, so he'll be here maybe tomorrow night. We can
probably,
pick his brain. Yeah, okay.
He might be able to, hopefully he can send out the lecture.
Yeah, okay, good, okay. So this is very much, as you were saying, it's really about the here and now and language, right? This and the indifferent this. Okay. Any other sections here? This is, he goes on to point it out in 108, 107 and 108, the pointing out, and then of course the meaning before that as universal. Yeah, and again, right here, this again is an argument with Schelling on intellectual intuition, too, and sense certainty. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. And then he'll go through the Eucharist and the mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus as an example, right? I mean, later on page 65 in section 109, the appeal to universal experience, right? We may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. In this respect, we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back. So he gives this example of ancient times to the elementary school of wisdom, that is through the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus, and that they still have to learn the secret meaning of the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. For he who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part, he brings around about the nothingness of such things himself in his dealings with them, and in part, he sees them reduce themselves to nothingness. Even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but on the contrary, show themselves to be the most profoundly initiated into wine and song and orgy, etc. For they do not stand idly, right, in front of sensuous things as if these possessed intrinsic being, but despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall through to without ceremony and eat them up, right? And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things. This is a great, I mean, this is almost comic, you know, in a way, what he's doing here. It's funny, yeah, right? Okay, so this is kind of the end of the sense certainty. I mean, we can go back to this next week. I just want to go over to perception just for a second, because what he's really trying to do here, the thing and deception, and this is where the Gegenstand also comes back in terms of the thing, right? Let me just say. So again, look, the antagonist, if you will, sense certainty, pure empiricism, right? Dewey's spectator theory of knowledge is also being, taken on. Etc. And the movement of the observed consciousness and the observing consciousness is the narration, if you will, to go back to last week. The movement from receiving to conceiving, right? And how that happens, and that becomes a purification, that kind of reciprocity. So you must always have the gaze directed towards the observed consciousness, right? Because you are in the position of the observed consciousness. Again, you are the object, to go back to where we were earlier. Okay? So perception, the thing, and deception. So what he does, he wants to talk about perception, a dialectic between the same movement of reflection, same movement of perception. So perception is first differentiated from sensation. Right? He's going to go there, right? The latter, as we've learned, sensor is immediate and unrelated. It has no relations, in a sense. So the perception grasps that same sense data, as we see in sensor, as related to each other. So that's the difference that's going on, right? That in perception, we begin to see the relations of the things, right? And we begin to see the deception too, right? Right? Yeah. And to what extent, the sensory data, if you will, or sense certainty, determines the thing to be a particular thing as we go on. So here we have again the observing consciousness, right? The for us and the for itself is the observed consciousness. So this dialectic is always important. The for us, the for and the for sich. The observing consciousness, the for us, and the observed consciousness, the for itself, in the Gegenstand, right? So you're recasting, basically, the sense certainty into new terms through perception, right? And reflection and relations, right? In this case. Okay? So, I mean, any thoughts about the perception or any, passages that stuck out? We can go back to this next week. We can recap since some people are not here. Yeah. Any, no?
I've read the perception section, but I didn't get to it. I mean, this is so much reading, so dense.
Okay, yes, dense.
You know,
yeah.
like-
Yeah, no, I understand.
Like,
Okay.
it's crazy.
Okay. All right, I hear you. Well, I know we're crazy. I got it. Okay. Yeah. Well, why don't I do this? I mean, the perception is important, and the lever is force and understanding. Why don't we try to go through those next week, and anything you might have, again, on introduction and sense certainty. I thought we did okay with the sense certainty, to try to get this down. The main antagonists, again, here are the tradition of empiricism, right? Let's go this way. Antagonists are empiricism, the empirical, right? And also, of course, the speculative theory of knowledge, right? And also, in a different way, he's beginning to break up, spectator theories of knowledge, right? Which is also going on in the transition to perception, where new terms come in, and the movement is really going on between the thing, the Gegenstand, and the moving towards that. And we begin to see, we don't see so many relations here in sense certainty, but we begin to see relations in perception. Mm-hmm. And the main thing that the relations are seen through are through the for itself, right? And the in itself, right? Okay, we begin to see this, the observing consciousness and then the observed consciousness. And I think that's a good way of looking at the two actors that are, playing out here. The moment of observation is always through an observing consciousness and an observed consciousness. So this again is important. Okay, and the other thing is I would read the section again on negation and determinate negation, and also the section I think would really be worth looking at, the is and the is not as well, on the night, the now and the this and the night, the deconstruction of sense certainty, and then of course, what Josh was referring to in terms of the back of consciousness and the concept formation itself, right? So again, try to think this again as always as movement, not as anything that we're going to get fixed into. So you have the collapse in perception of contradiction into sameness in perception, right? And then you have an installation of contradiction into sameness. I'll try to show this in the perception next week, or how we get deceived by the thing.
What was the other section besides determinate negation you recommended rereading?
Oh, the one on the is and the is not. Yeah.
I've found that section 3, force and understanding, to be one of the hardest sections.
It's very hard because it's taken into account a lot of the Newtonian physics there and other things too. So I don't know if we're going to really be able to. I'll do my best. But it's a kind of catapult, if you will, or a lever towards consciousness. This is where he's trying to go. Again, these three chapters, if you will, sense certainty, perception, right, and then of course force and understanding, are basically preludes to consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. Consciousness, right? And the formation of consciousness. We're not conscious yet. We're beginning to see patterns and getting inklings, but we're not yet at the level of consciousness of these things. So really, the retrospective would take back to here, right? I mean, the preface as being retrospective in terms of it was written afterwards and actually shows the system of knowing at work, the introduction, which actually is the quest for a presuppositionalist philosophy, right? And all that it involves. And then the 3 chapters of the empiricists, you know, the other British empiricists, perception and the primacy of perception and going against that and how we get deceived there, and then ultimately about force, in which contradiction really plays out, and understanding, you know, how the Verstanden goes through. And you know this in Kant, you know, the understanding through the categories, right? And again, this is a very long dialogue with Kant.
Yeah.
You know, Kraften und Verstanden is the German, and you know, it's a very powerful, you know, moment for them. You know, it's, you know, gravitation, laws of gravity, all these things are working out in his head, you know, when he's going through this again. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, but I mean, any passages you want us to focus on that you got to, or?
In that one?
Yeah, in Force and Understanding. Yeah, we can put it on the drawing board. It's the least marked of all of mine, so it's the least read. I mean, I have some markings, but I can tell that for me, I'm with you in a way. I have some marginal notes, but anyway, you can see now the concept. I see, I have little markings here, and I change actually some of the German, so I'll give you some of that.
Okay.
You know.
I'm gonna have to look again at it harder.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, you know, we're really going to look about supersession here. We're going to start talking about supersession.
Okay.
And if you look at proposition 141, 142, that's where force is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Force is preservation, and the play.
Right, holding things together.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very interesting section.
Oh yeah.
But it's hard to. I kept reading and then getting it.
Yeah. Well, that's what this stuff forces us to do.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe the truth of self-certainty instead of sense certainty is going to be much easier for us, you know, as we get into the meat of, you know, consciousness and self-consciousness. Yeah, going forward. And then I think we're going to read. We can go over the ethical order pretty easily in Spirit. These are things, you know, we can always return to. They're easier, but right now this is the philosophical background, you know, to where the phenomenology is going. Yeah. So okay. So we'll look at that next week, and if you have chance, I mean, the time you could go ahead to self-consciousness. You know, the truth of you know. I got some time. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I don't sleep.
Read ahead.
I think sleeping's a waste of time. But anyway, you know, I have that in common with some people in the history of, you know,
that's good.
So good. All right. So yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what I got here in terms of notes.
Yeah, somebody's at the door telling us to leave.
The cops are here.
Yeah.
We're leaving.
She wants to ask me a question. No, only on Tuesday and Wednesday,
How was your trip, Bill? Were you away?
Yeah, I left on Thursday, came back last night.
How'd it go?
It went better than I thought.
Wait, what did you do? You went to
I went to Georgia.
Right?
For this. It's a vigil at the School of the Americas.
That's right.
It was actually, I think it, given how much, well, actually how little, there were a lot of snafus going into it.
Uh-huh.
And I was afraid it was going to just be like,